we will make the point in every single one of these fora that the aggression against Ukraine will be met with, as I've said, and others have said, massive consequences.
NATO foreign ministers issued yet another warning to Russia today. Any further aggression against Ukraine would carry a, quote, heavy price for Russia. The military alliance held an extraordinary session ahead of a series of key diplomatic engagements with the Kremlin next week. Ukraine is sounding the alarm over Russia's buildup of troops near its border. U.S. intelligence is suggesting Russia could be planning an invasion as soon as this month. Mélanie Joly is Minister of Foreign Affairs. She's in Ottawa. Hey, Minister, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
You tweeted today, quote, Canada will always support our allies and stand by Ukraine and its people. That country, as you well know, wants Canada to expand the size and scope of its military mission in that country. Will Canada do that?
Well, first and foremost, we're very preoccupied with the military buildup by Russia next to the Ukrainian border. And we know that Ukraine's security is Europe's security. It's the world's security. Canada is already in Ukraine through different means, but including also the fact that through Operation Unifier, we're training the military forces there. And we will continue to do so. And also, as a foreign affairs minister, I'm really much more working on the diplomatic side to make sure that there's no escalation and there's then a risk of miscalculation.
Fair enough. But as I understand it, the calls for more from Canada have also come from Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Ministry. So, you know, what's on the table? I mean, as they describe it, at meetings you had with them last month, you, quote, discussed concrete steps to deter Russia from further aggressive actions. So what are those steps?
So first and foremost, it's really working with all the members of the alliance of NATO to make sure that we are united. And that's why we held a meeting today to prepare a series of discussions that will happen next week between the US and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and within also the OSCE, who is the organization in charge of also security that engages directly with Russia. So these important diplomatic talks are fundamental to the future of the security of the region in Ukraine and in the entire region, as I mentioned. And Russia has a choice ball. It is between dialogue with us and also deterrence.
Conventional wisdom on this seems to be that what Russia wants is a guarantee that Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO. Russia wants that said out loud, basically. Is that a non-starter for Canada?
Our position on Ukraine's accession to NATO has not changed.
And it is?
Our position has been for now a long time that one day when Ukraine is ready and the alliance is ready, that they should.
Fair enough. Do you think NATO is going to agree to that?
Well, we know right now that we need to engage with Russia on different issues to make sure that we can de-escalate. It is really, really important. We know that the military buildup is real. We know also that we have to take things extremely, extremely seriously. And that's why it's been my top priority as we as I've been the Foreign Affairs Minister now for 2 months.
What's the way you see out of this as those Russian troops build up?
Well, you know, NATO is extremely powerful when we're united. It includes the US, us, it includes Europe. And so it's an important block of countries that can really show and have a lot of strength altogether. And that's why it's been keeping Euro-Atlantic stability for now a long, long time, even through Cold War. And so that's why it's important that we work, all member states together. But at the same time, I've mentioned a bit earlier in the interview about the Operation Unifier we have in Ukraine, but Canada is elsewhere on the eastern flank of Europe, we are also in Latvia. And it is important for us to protect the eastern flank of Russia, on the European side, of course, because it is the best way to make sure that the Baltic states also are well protected.
On Kazakhstan, we've seen the violence breaking out against protesters. It seems almost out of control there. Today we're hearing authorities have been given the go-ahead to shoot and kill without warning. You have called for restraint and de-escalation. That hasn't happened. Have you summoned Kazakhstan's ambassador to Canada to discuss this situation?
This is a very, very important situation. Of course, we condemn any form of violence. We're very preoccupied with what's going on in Kazakhstan. We want to make sure that peaceful protests are able to happen. We're by the side of people in Kazakhstan, and I'll be talking to our ambassador very soon. So it is very, very, it is, like I said, a top priority.
What is Canada prepared to do? Are sanctions on the table?
I will have more to say in the coming hours and days on this issue. I also, I'm in close contacts with key allies on this question. We know that Russia has a 360-degree strategy when it comes to Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Great North, and of course, the southern part of it in Africa, and also much more on the side of Kazakhstan and the neighboring states.
And I, obviously you're in touch with Canadian embassy personnel in Kazakhstan. What can you tell us about the people there? Are they safe? Will they stay in Kazakhstan?
Well, we're assessing the situation. We are always there to make sure that consular services are offered also to Canadians that are in Kazakhstan. And as I said, I will be in contact with our ambassador very shortly.
Just to Flight PS752 now, if you don't mind. 2 years now since it was shot down, eviscerating so many families in Canada. Iran now rejecting talks on accountability. What do you do now? Do you take this to the ICAO? Where does Canada go on this?
So Canada and the coordination group. So, Paul, this is also the other countries that had nationals in the PS752 downing, and so in the flight. And so these are UK, Sweden, and Ukraine. So Canada and these three other countries have been really trying to negotiate in good faith with Iran. Unfortunately, we gave an ultimatum mid-December to make sure that Iran would come back to us by January 5th, and they did not show up, and they didn't engage into negotiations. So based on that, we're looking at all avenues, and at the end of the day, we're on the side of families that are seeking justice, and we will seek justice from Iran.
But what's it, ICAO then, and then The Hague after that? Like where does this? There are many
avenues. Obviously, I won't disclose our entire legal strategy on air, but at the end of the day, what we want is reparation for families, compensation for families, and that includes obviously accountability and transparency from Iran. So we're stronger when we're united with also Sweden, UK, and Ukraine. That's why I had conversations with each of these countries' foreign ministers over the past weeks, and I'll continue to push, politically speaking, with these countries, as we want to be in lockstep with them when it comes to dealing with this very important issue against Iran.
Last thing, two years later, what degree of optimism can you tell the families that you have about reparations and accountability? Is that something they can expect, do you think?
Well, I had a conversation with them earlier today. And obviously, they're going through enormous grief, and it's difficult for them to find closure as obviously things are taking time. And so I share their impatience, I share their anger. That's why very quickly I wanted to call this group of countries to really drive the process And that's why we're opening a new chapter now, and we will seek justice before international fora.
Minister of Foreign Affairs Mélanie Joly, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Prime Minister Trudeau is set to participate in a ceremony marking the anniversary tomorrow. Iran, meanwhile, has refused to negotiate with Canada and allies over the downing of the flight. Now, Canada says it will explore other legal avenues. So what could that entail? And will the families ever see justice for the killing of their loved ones? Kaveh Shahrooz is a lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He also advises the Association of PS752 Families. He's in Toronto. Kaveh Sharoz, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yesterday, a deadline for Iran came and went to engage in talks with Canada and allies. Iran gave the group a, quote, unequivocal response that it does not see a need to negotiate with the group. Does this surprise you at all?
Unfortunately, it does not. Iran's entire approach to this investigation has been to put up walls, to obfuscate, to hide the truth. From day one, it lied about the attack on the plane. It bulldozed the crash site. It didn't hand over the black box. And this is just the latest, that they have refused time and again to sit down and negotiate in good faith with the countries that have been affected by this. So unfortunately, it doesn't, and it's entirely consistent with the way they've behaved throughout the life of the Islamic regime in Iran for 40 years.
And even just, relative to this, given everything that you said in terms of Iran's behavior, why do you think Canada and allies waited even this long for the country to engage in talks even?
Well, the international law on this is primarily based on the Chicago Convention that governs civil aviation. And the Chicago Convention says that the parties have to sit down and negotiate in good faith. Now, frankly, I think Iran a long time ago should have been seen as a party that didn't want to negotiate in good faith. I think, the parties wanted to give Iran every opportunity to come to the negotiating table, and it didn't do so. I'm sorry that it's taken 2 years, but I'm glad that our patience has finally been exhausted and we're looking at next steps.
So let's talk about those next steps. Canada and allies saying they will focus on subsequent actions in accordance with international law. What would that look like? What could that look like?
Well, one path that I think is most likely is to now take this conflict over to ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a body of the United Nations. That body will investigate and will ultimately come to a decision if the parties aren't satisfied with that decision. But that decision is not entirely legal in nature. There's also a lot of politics involved. If the parties aren't satisfied with that, then they're looking at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. I remain skeptical that ICAO will be able to deal with this. And I suspect that in due course, this issue will go to the ICJ.
And would that be the end of it? Are there other options after that, or is that it?
I think the ICJ will probably be the end of the road in terms of putting forth legal arguments. Ultimately, the ICJ can grant, financial compensation. It's not a criminal body. So it remains for us to think about how we can actually hold people criminally accountable for this. But the legal compensation process will ultimately end with the ICJ.
Indeed. I was just going to ask, this is about more than just reparations for the families, right?
Absolutely. The families have repeatedly said that reparations are really low on their list of priorities. They want truth above anything else. Hopefully the ICJ can deliver that to some extent. But really the other thing that they want is they want people to be held accountable. The International Criminal Court is a body that doesn't really have jurisdiction to investigate this. There are some very narrow paths that I know, the Association of Families is investigating. And I hope, Canada will push for those narrow paths to be followed. But really the ICJ, I think, and the compensation and truth-seeking may be the most available path for Canada and the other countries.
Separately, as you well know, the RCMP has refused to open its own criminal investigations, left it up to Ukraine. Families say the RCMP has been slow on this and is not handing over crucial evidence to Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
I entirely agree with the families. I don't really understand why the RCMP has been dragging its feet. By its own admission, it's been very slow. The RCMP can conduct its investigations independently. And I think they have a lot of information. You know, there have been a number of reports written at the international level. The families themselves have written a very detailed report setting out issues to investigate. So I really do hope that the RCMP launches its own investigation and works more quickly with the Ukrainian authorities.
Obviously, you've been following this story from the get-go and advising families on this. 2 years have now gone by. What should Canadians know about this tragedy, do you think, that they might not know now, and where things go from here?
What I hope Canadians know is that the families that have been affected by this and the entire community around them has really just been devastated. I mean, just imagine, your wife, your child, your husband going on vacation to visit some family members and just being blown out of the sky. And not just that, but having the government that did it lie about it repeatedly and refuse to work to get to the bottom of things. So I hope Canadians remember that a lot of their compatriots were on that plane. And I hope that they remember that the Iranian regime is one that for 40 years has committed acts like this against Canadians, against Americans, against a lot of Iranians. And that the only way really to get justice is to put pressure on the Iranian regime. And that's really the only thing that they respond to.
Closure is such an overused word, but I'm going to guess that none of the families can move on from this at this point. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think that's exactly right. And a lot of the families talk about closure. And I think closure has different components. It has, you can't have closure if you don't actually know officially what happened. I mean, the families speculate as to what happened. They think that this was a deliberate attack, and the use of this plane was basically, used as a civilian shield. But they want the truth, and they want to know who was responsible for it, and they want those people held accountable. And until that happens, unfortunately, they won't have closure.
Do you believe that there will come accountability? Is there reason to think it will eventually get to that?
I think it will be difficult. I hope that Canada, Ukraine, Great Britain, and others keep the pressure on Iran. Deep down, though, I think there will probably never be a full accounting for this until the regime in Iran is changed and that there's a democratic government that then holds people accountable. Until then, I think the most we can possibly hope for is maybe financial compensation.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
That's Kaveh Sharoz in Toronto.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.